10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I don't know, do people have specific contracts that they want to go over today? We can leave that open if there are specific addenda or contracts that you are curious about, or if we want a general overview. I just try to kind of take the temperature of who's here and see what they're really looking for today. Hi, Graham.
Good morning, Kady.
Good morning, Crystal.
Hi, I'm here just to get whatever information you have. So I don't know to look for anything specific at the moment, but whatever you're here to discuss, I'm here to listen to.
Awesome. Hi, Graham.
Hey, Kady. How are you?
Great. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Alicia said she would just prefer a general overview. Graham, are there any contracts in particular that you're looking to get insight on today?
Not particularly. I just thought it'd be handy to have a refresher.
Okay.
Just so used to kind of doing things in a normal way. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything.
Great. Yeah, that's always a good idea. So, okay, we'll just go ahead and get started then with we'll start with our purchase agreement, our offer to purchase. And Graham, since you're pretty seasoned, go ahead and, fill in if you think I missed anything that you think is important to explain too. This is super informal. Everybody just, if you have a question, just unmute and ask it or put it in the chat box, whatever. I'm very informal today. So,
okay, good.
Okay. So this is our offer to purchase real estate and acceptance. When you write an offer, this is what you're doing for your buyer. So, just at the top, it's just the general information. So it's the buyer's name, the address of the property and the city, and then the parcel number, which can be found in the MLS. This is just laying out that it is accepted in as is physical condition, including latent defects, but it has all of the land, all the rights, privileges, and easements, all buildings and fixtures. It even lays out garage door openers and controls, because you wouldn't believe how many times that becomes a problem, and all permanently attached carpeting, all of the landscaping, everything like that. So, and then it gives you the option to check off whatever else might be included or you're asking to be included within. And you can find that generally within the MLS as well. So this is where you take care of all of those important appliances and things that are kind of a gray area about whether they go with the property or whether they are chattel. So unless otherwise agreed by the parties, permanently fixtures, which are permanently affixed to the property, are presumed to be conveyed to the buyer. Chattel are personal possessions not affixed to the property that are excluded in this agreement unless listed below. So everybody probably remembers chattel from, that's one of the things that I do remember from real estate classes is talking about chattel. So there is a space, like say they're going to leave the pool table in the basement and you already know that. Say there's a freezer in the basement or in the garage and they're planning to leave that. You might put that there just because it's not specified up in the top paragraph. Fixtures excluded from this agreement. So sometimes you will have someone say, I've had curtains quite a bit. Graham, I don't know about you. I've had people say these curtains are, for whatever reason, they're sentimental or whatever the case may be. They want to keep that. So those are not staying with the property. Or chandeliers. That's the other big one that I've seen. This is an heirloom chandelier. So as a note on the listing side, when you take a listing, it's a good idea to ask about those things. Just because I usually recommend to clients, if you're not planning to leave it with the property, just remove it and replace it now for the time of the listing, so that the pictures reflect that and everything, just so that there's no confusion. But if you come across that situation when you're writing an offer for a buyer, that's important to note. Secondary offer. Typically, you're not writing secondary offers, but the case could arise that your client wants to write an offer on a property that's already under contract, or sometimes you lose out in a multiple offer situation and the listing agent will say, you can resubmit as a secondary offer. So when you do that, It will become the primary contract upon the buyer's receipt of a signed copy of the release of the previous primary contract on or before. And then this allows you to set kind of a deadline for that, because your client might not want to wait, an entire month and still be the backup at that time. So the buyer deposits earnest money as outlined below within 4 days from the date of receipt of the release, notifying the buyer that the buyer's contract with the seller is the primary contract now. So the buyer may terminate this secondary contract at any time before they receive the release of the primary contract by delivering written notice to the seller or seller's agents. So that's really important to note. So if you decide to submit a secondary offer for your buyer, and then they would like to look at another property and write another offer, they say, I don't really want to be the secondary offer anymore. You need to deliver written notice to the seller's agent at that point, to let them know that you are withdrawing your secondary offer. That can be kind of complicated if you don't do that, because your buyer could technically end up being under contract on 2 houses, and nobody wants that. That would be very bad. So that's kind of the deal with secondary offers. Any questions about that?
Mm-mm.
Okay. And then line 30, that's the price, pretty straightforward there. Earnest money deposited in a non-interest bearing trust account with the escrow agent identified below. That's important. We used to hold earnest money funds at the brokerage. We no longer do that. There are some brokerages that will, but we require the money to go to the title company. Okay, within 4 dates of acceptance, as defined herein, and credited against purchase price. And then you can select if they're going to wire the funds, write a check to the escrow agent, or you can do the promissory note, which just allows you to have a placeholder for that earnest money until you move forward with either a check or wiring. Another good thing to note here is that Ohio Real Title and a couple of other companies actually have an earnest money deposit tool on their website where you can just deposit the money electronically. That's a super nice and convenient way to do it, because as the agent, you really don't want to have anything to do with that earnest money. You don't want to touch it, like really you don't. So, because that's a really easy way to get in trouble and have problems with your license. So anything you can do to simplify that process, that is the way to go. Then you'll put your cash down payment here. So, typically I say to do percentages here instead of dollar amounts, just because if anything changes with the purchase price, then you don't have to change all of those lines as well. So, say they think they're going to put down 10%, but they might put down a little bit more. In that case, you could put, as an example, at least 10%, just because that gives the listing agent a good idea of how much cash they're bringing to the table. And you can either, sometimes I put remainder here. Sometimes I put, up to 90%. So there's a couple different ways to do it there. There's some controversy around the idea that you can do TBD here, to be determined, and then remainder, or per lender is another thing that people write sometimes. Some listing agents will push back on that, but typically, it's just up to what your client's lender is going to say anyway. So that could change at some point as well. So then you select the type of loan, or if it's cash. We do have the other box here. If it's a hard money loan, that could be for a USDA loan. And there's a couple, like an OFA loan, an Ohio Finance Agency loan. So there are a couple different options, and we do have a spot for that. So then the parties hereby direct the escrow agent to confirm the receipt of the earnest money by delivering written notice of the parties to the party's real estate agent, or party directly if they are not represented. Ohio law requires the escrow agent to deposit in excess of $10,000 that must be conveyed by a wire transfer. So we don't accept personal checks, certified checks, anything like that for anything over $10,000. This is an important paragraph to go over. We used to have a separate addendum for it, but we have now incorporated it into the purchase agreement. So the broker, its agents, and employees will never ask any party to wire funds or request personal financial data, including without limitation, credit or debit card or bank card numbers. The party shall independently confirm any requests and instructions, including for transfer or deposit directly with the escrow agent identified herein. So you just want to make sure that your clients know that if they receive different wire transfer information throughout the course of the transaction, don't trust that. Call the title company directly, because more and more people's emails are getting duplicated. There's a lot of the PHISH phishing going on. And real estate, the industry has been a target of that in recent years. I actually heard of an agent down in the Fairlawn area a few years ago. Their client ended up losing $50,000 because they received different wire transfer information and did not question it, just thought that it was real because the email signature was the title company email signature. They duplicated even that. So you don't want that. That's not good. Nobody wants that. So just make your clients aware of that. Okay, this is our financing contingency paragraph. So this offer is conditioned on the buyer making written application for the above mortgage within, typically I put 7 days here, anywhere from 5 to 7 days is pretty typical. If you're writing it right before a weekend, I always recommend doing 7 because you automatically lose 2 days because typically the loan officers are not originating loans on Saturdays and Sundays. So then after you need to put in the date for the written commitment. So that's when all the conditions are met, everything is good to go. Typically, that's going to be about a week before your closing date. So today is March 12th. Let's say that we are doing a normal 30-day close. So that would bring us to April 12th for a closing date. So I would typically say about April 6th. Graham, does that line up with what you would do? Just about?
Yeah, pretty much. It really, depends on the circumstances of the lender and the buyer.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's pretty safe to say. I would say a minimum of 7 days.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So then this says if the buyer does not timely obtain a written loan commitment, then this agreement shall be null and void, and the parties shall promptly sign a mutual release authorizing the earnest money to be returned to the buyer. So this is protecting your buyer yet again. If something goes wrong with their financing, they would get that earnest money deposit back the way that our contract is written. If there is a dispute regarding the earnest money, Ohio law requires the escrow agent to hold it in its trust account until the escrow agent receives a written mutual authorization of both parties specifying disbursement or a court order directing disbursement. Closing. I will say typically you don't have very many disputes on earnest money because it's laid out in the contract pretty well. So typically, especially in regards to the financing, you're not going to have an issue. All funds and documents necessary to complete this agreement shall be placed in escrow with the lending institution and this is where you would put your title company. So let's just say Ohio Real Title. And typically, the buyer is supposed to, by law, be able to choose the title company that's being used. Sometimes you'll have listing agents push back on that. For situations where it's maybe an estate where they've already started some of the title work to make sure that everything was good, or if they're paying a lot of buyer closing costs, which that sometimes they'll say, okay, well, if we're paying that, then we want to choose the title company. On or before, this is where you'll put that closing date. So we said that would be April 12th. And then title transfer from seller to buyer on or about. It usually is the next day. On occasion, you can get a closing and a title transfer on the same day, but both parties typically have to sign pretty early in the morning on that closing date. So that's something definitely to check with the lender and also the title company if that's going to be possible and get agreement for that. Walkthrough. It is agreed that the buyer may walk through the property on or about, I put a range here, I put 1 to 3 days, just because that gives you some flexibility. You want that to be as close to title transfer as possible, just so that you can make sure that the property is in the same or similar condition, absent normal wear and tear. This is also a time to make sure if there were any repairs requested on the removal of contingencies form, you want to make sure that that has been taken care of as well at this point. Ideally, you've already gotten documentation of that so that you don't have an issue right before closing, but this is a great time just to make sure. If the buyer conducts a walkthrough, they do not raise issues about the condition of the property if the condition existed when the buyer last viewed or inspected it. So this is not the time to nitpick. This is not the time to bring up new issues. You are simply making sure that it looks the same as when you were last there. If there is a huge issue, so something common would be like what the sellers were moving out and they punched a hole in the drywall with a piece of furniture. That's something that you would bring to the attention of the listing agent and the title company in writing. And then the parties will agree at that point to either give a buyer credit to repair the material adverse change, or for sums to be withheld by the escrow agent from the seller's proceeds pending completion of the repair. Any failure by buyer to conduct a walkthrough shall be deemed buyer's absolute waiver of it and acceptance of the property in its as-is condition. So I would recommend when you have a buyer under contract, putting a calendar event in your calendar to make sure that a week or so before you confirm a time for this walkthrough, just so that your buyer doesn't say, well, nobody reminded me that I needed to schedule a walkthrough. You definitely want to do what you can. If they don't do it though, or they say, you know what, I think it's okay. Any issue that they discover after that, they have accepted the property at that point as is. Possession. The seller shall deliver possession and occupancy on or before 6 p.m. We like for this to say 0 days. We want it to be the same day that the deed is recorded, which is title transfer. So that would be 4/13/2022. Every once in a while, there are situations where the seller needs a day or so if they're closing on a new property and closing on the property your client is buying on the same day. Sometimes they'll ask for an extra day. If that happens, please talk to me or Rick or someone in leadership just to make sure that your paperwork is all good to go. And the buyer transfers utilities commencing on the date of possession. Title. This explains everything that is involved in the title process that is going to be accepted and transferred to the buyer. It goes over the fact that the seller should convey marketable title. So that means there's no dower rights, which is when they're married. That's been taken care of. Free and clear of all liens and encumbrances whatsoever, except for the mortgage that the buyer is obtaining. Restrictions, conditions, easements, and encroachments as do not materially adverse affect the use or value of the property. Zoning ordinances, if any, taxes and assessments, both general and special, not yet due and payable. The seller furnishes an owner's fee policy of title insurance from the escrow agent for the purchase price, with the cost of the insuring premium split equally between the seller and the buyer. So the buyer and seller, as a customary practice in Ohio, split the insurance premium for title equally. The seller has 30 days after written notice to remove any title defects that are discovered. And if they are not able to do that, the buyer can either accept the title subject to the defect without reduction in the purchase price or terminate the agreement. So if a giant lien or a cloud on title is discovered, that lays out how you handle that. So they can, continue to work through that because that will transfer with the property, doesn't stay with the seller. It stays on the property, or they can terminate the agreement at that time. And if they elect to terminate the agreement, the earnest money is returned to the buyer. Any questions so far? I know that this is a lot and I feel like I'm just talking and talking.
No questions right now. You're doing great, Kady. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Crystal. Alicia?
Yeah, I have a quick one. Regarding title insurance, I know you said it's customary for them to split the cost of that. Does that ever come up that one of them, especially now that it's a seller's market, maybe the seller would refuse to do so? And would you write it in right there, or how does that work?
I would suggest not writing it in there, but I would do like a separate addendum that says, I guess really, I haven't come across that. I don't know. I know Sandy's on here now. Graham, have you come across doing that in this market?
No, never.
No, I haven't either.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could negotiate that. Like I've had buyers offer to pay part of the seller's closing costs. So I guess that's effectively the same thing. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing is if you talk to the lender and you talk to the title company, you can negotiate things like that. But typically you're going to want the seller to also pay half of that. That's how it's typically going to go. Anything else right now? Okay. All right. Prorations. Tenant security deposits credited to the buyer through escrow. Rents, if any, taxes and assessments, and homeowner association fees and assessments, if any, shall be prorated by the escrow agent as of the date of title transfer. Taxes and assessments are prorated based on the latest available tax duplicate. The parties consult directly with the escrow agent and or county auditor's office about the property taxes, as the latest tax duplicate may or may not reflect accurately the amount of taxes owed. So basically all of this is saying that the title company is going to make sure that the taxes are as accurate as possible. If the property is new construction and recently completed or in the process of completion, then the escrow agent will make a good faith estimate of the taxes that will be owed on the value of the improved property to the date of title transfer, and reserve sufficient funds in escrow from the seller's net proceeds to pay those taxes when they become due and payable after title transfer. Escrow agent is instructed to release the balance of the funds on reserve upon notice from the county auditor that taxes on the land and improvements have been paid in full to the date of title transfer. Escrow agent shall withhold. I typically put, so if this is a property that has septic and well, you will put 0 here or not applicable. But typically I put 250 here, depending on the size of the house. And if anybody's living there, if nobody's living there, you might withhold a little bit less, but nobody really fights about this, because if there is money left over, the seller is returned that escrow after the title company has taken care of paying the final bills for water and sewer. If any, then either pay said charges or verify seller's payment of them and remit any balance to the seller. So it lays it out right there. If it is deemed subject to agricultural tax recoupment, then I always check seller agrees to pay the amount of such recoupment. Have either anybody come across this? I have not ever had a property where this applied.
No.
Yeah, so that I just always put seller so that my buyer is protected in the event that something weird happens and that actually does need to be addressed. Okay. Charges and escrow instructions. This agreement shall be used as escrow instructions subject to the escrow agent's standard conditions of acceptance, not inconsistent with this agreement. The seller pays the following costs through escrow. So the seller pays the real estate transfer tax, which is regulated by which county it's in, any amount required to discharge any mortgage, lien, or encumbrance not assumed by the buyer, the title exam, and 1/2 of the cost of the insuring premium for owner's fee of policy of title insurance, any prorations due to the buyer. So that would be taxes, for instance, the broker's commissions. So that takes care of your money right there. 1/2 of the escrow, unless FHA or VA regulations prohibit payment of escrow fees by buyer, in which case seller pays the entire escrow fee. Seller shall directly pay all utility charges to the date of title transfer or date of possession, whichever is later. Tenant security deposits, if any, shall be credited in escrow to the buyer. And this is a good paragraph to go over with your client as well. The buyer shall pay following through escrow, the following through escrow unless prohibited by FHA VA regulations. They pay 1/2 of the escrow fee, 1/2 of the insurance premium of the owner's fee title insurance, like we discussed earlier, all recording fees for the deed and any mortgage. And then note, the buyer's agent commission is comprised of two components: the cooperative compensation payable from the listing brokerage. So that's what's offered in the multiple listing service. And then our additional commission for our office, which is $200, will come from the buyer through escrow. So I've never had anybody really question the fact that there's that $200. I just tell them that it's basically just the cost to complete the transaction from our office's standpoint. Okay, this next paragraph, we've had some changes to this when we redid the contracts in September. So it protects you a little bit more as well. So the buyer either elects or does not elect a limited home warranty. We'll say that it's America's Preferred. And that they're going to do it. And the base price for that warranty is $425. And we're just going to say in this case that the seller is going to pay that. The buyer sometimes will pay it, especially in this market, if they want to be protected, but they don't want to hurt their chances in the negotiation. And another important thing to note is even if they say, you know, I don't think I want it, but then they decide that they do later, they can add that at a later date and you can still order it for them. The parties acknowledge that the limited warranty does not cover pre-existing defects and requires the buyer to pay a deductible in the event of a claim, and the broker and or its agents may receive a fee from the warranty provider. So if you write in a home warranty and you order it through America's Preferred, we get, I believe it's $50 that is paid to you out of it's a total of 100. Half of that goes to the office, and then $50 comes to you. Sandy, you unmuted. Did you have something to say?
I did about that because this is a real bugaboo with me. So, and I just want to be clear because, you know, we changed this. I mean, obviously a while ago, but we now, why do we now have to still have the buyer waive that on the actual form if we're checking this box that they do not want, you know, the warranty? That's something that's recently new. I know that, right?
That's it actually, so that's a very good question because I was always taught that it was required no matter what. And some people have said that they did not know that. I verified it with America's Preferred Home Warranty that it's required. So the reason why it's required to have that waiver in by the buyer, even if they're choosing not to do it. And same with the listing, if the listing agent, if the seller is not planning to add a warranty with the listing, America's Preferred Home Warranty will cover a large portion of any errors and omissions claims that happen throughout the transaction if we have that acceptance or waiver in the file. And that's why.
Okay. Yeah, because, you know, we never had to do that before. And I've always been submitting it and I've checked the box on here, you know, no, the buyer doesn't want it. Seller doesn't want to pay for it. So that's always the way I've submitted it. So now, and I'm running into this now because I know I've sent a couple things to you through command missing that document, but I'm finding that at the end of the day, maybe at the midnight hour, like I'm negotiating after inspections right now. And you know, that may change. So I don't want to submit it. Then I have to go back and change it if they decide to now add it after inspection or the buyer now wants to pay for it. So that's the only reason it just seems to me it's real clunky. It seems like it's a lot, but you know,
and I'm hoping I totally get that, Sandy, and I'm hoping to mitigate that. I'm going to put out an email. We recently decided that we will change the requirement for when you submit documents on a purchase to 14 days after the offer is accepted, just because then you only have to submit it one time. You're sure that your reasonably sure that your escrow letter is going to be accurate at that point, that there's not going to be a price reduction. You can just add your removal of contingency at that time. You know, you'll have the earnest money proof. So there's no longer that 48-hour clock on it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yay.
So, because I recognize too, that that's kind of a pain, especially if you do end up changing that, you know, after inspections or something like that. So that was the purpose of that. For listings, the rule is still going to be 48 hours just to make sure that it's good to go before, you know, it gets too far into the MLS.
I gotcha. Okay. Yep. why I jumped on here today. There's one more and I'll mute myself until we get there. Thank
Okay.
you.
Sounds good. All right. Any other questions so far? Great. Okay, now the fun part, inspections. This agreement is subject to the buyer's inspections as elected below, which shall be conducted by an independent professional inspector of the buyer's exclusive choice within specified number of days from the date of acceptance as herein defined. While brokers and agents may suggest or refer inspectors or contractors to the buyer is solely responsible for choosing and retaining any inspector, contractor, or other service provider. The buyer acknowledges that the waiver of any inspection or evaluation of the property is against the advice of the buyer's broker and agents. The buyer is advised that real property may have latent hidden defects and conditions. Hence, the buyer must inspect and make diligent inquiry about the property, including the land, dwelling, and any improvements. The buyer shall inspect and evaluate all aspects of the property and retain independent professionals to do so on the buyer's behalf. When applicable, the buyer shall retain general home inspector licensed by the state of Ohio. So that's an important thing that's been added. As of, I believe it was July, we are supposed to use only licensed home inspectors through the state of Ohio. Having them be ASHI or InterNACHI certified is not the same as them being licensed through the state of Ohio. It's a recent law that was passed. So that's something important to note. And we do have a list of inspectors that are licensed, and you can check on the division website as well. The buyer shall review public records and consult with local and county government about the property, including without limitation as to buyer's intended use. The buyer shall carefully review seller's representations and disclosures and make inquiry of seller if additional information is deemed necessary for their due diligence. The buyer shall not rely upon any written or verbal representations of the broker and agents, and the buyer agrees to hold the broker and agents involved in this agreement harmless from any and all claims, actions, injuries, or damages relating to the property after title transfer. And then note inspections required by any state, county, local government, and or FHA VA, including the FHA appraisal and municipal point of sale inspections, our favorite, do not replace the need for the buyer's own inspections. So there are some cities, for people who are newer on this call, especially on the east side of Cleveland and mostly in Cuyahoga County, that require their own inspection. We do have a list of those available. So if you're working in Cuyahoga County in particular, make sure that you check and make sure that there's not a point of sale inspection. I could do a whole other class on the point of sale. So here's where you would select any inspections that your buyer is going to do. Let's say in this case, they're going to do the general home inspection, depending on, so I would say 7 days typically is what I'll put here, unless I know that I have an inspector lined up that can do it, you know, or that the buyer has already done their research on inspectors and has an inspector that they know they can get in earlier than that. Just with the way that inspectors have been very busy, that is kind of the general rule. Anything more than that, I would say 7 to 10 at the absolute most is what I've seen. And that's usually paid by the buyer. This one in particular, we're going to say it does not have septic or well. And then radon, I always put 10 days here just to give room for the results to come in, just to make sure. But typically you want your general inspector to be able to place that radon at the same time. In some cases, there are some inspectors who will even go a couple of days early and get in with the seller so that they're able to have the results on the day that you do your general inspection. And then other, I always select this, and I usually put within 14 days, just as recommended by the general inspector. So this protects your client if the general inspector is saying, oh, it looks like there's a possibility that there is, you know, a wood destroying insect problem. You should probably take a look at that. Or if they recommend a structural assessment or something like that, it gives you a little bit more wiggle room to be able to complete those inspections as well without having to do every single inspection right off the bat and pay for that. Now, the waiver, I don't do this. I never have my client initial the waiver, just because I know that we're protected by putting this here. But I still don't want the listing agent to come back and say, well, you said you waived these inspections, if the inspector comes back and says that. So I might be wrong on that. I don't know, Sandy and Graham, if you if you do that.
Gosh, I don't know. I'd like to open this up for a little discussion because I don't do that. And I'm curious why you do that, Kady. Is that something that, is that a way that you were taught to do it, or?
To not
know?
waive it?
Yeah, no, I always have my clients waive that. Absolutely. But
Yeah.
I'm wondering now, because you just mentioned a moment ago, and I wanted to ask your opinions on this, because so if you do not have a pest inspection checked, and then your general inspector finds evidence of some sort of infestation, and now you want to add that inspection, right? So you can then now add a pest inspection, but you may not be able to do that because you've checked the no box on a pest inspection. So now you're opening back that back up again. So you're right. If you don't have your buyer's initial that waiver, you can't open that back up and then have any other inspections, obviously. But do you ever have them waive that even after inspections are completed?
No.
Never do. Have
Nope.
you ever had pushback from the listing agent on that?
Nope. And I don't know if that's just been that they don't read it that closely, or,
That's interesting.
yeah.
Because
So, and I know
I
that,
never
like,
do that. Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, to me, the purchase of this is to protect the purpose
The
of
buyer.
this, to protect my
Yeah.
buyer. And
Right,
so,
right.
if they gave me pushback, I would, maybe say, well, just keep in mind that also says as recommended by general inspector. So, if you
Yeah,
want,
yeah.
I'll waive that after. But then you also have that removal of contingency at the same time. So to me, but yeah.
Interesting.
Good points for sure.
Well,
I think
and in
Rick
this
said
market
something
right
about that
now,
as well.
what's that?
I think Rick said something about that as well, but that's definitely, I think that's worth even further discussion.
Yeah, it is. I know, because I don't do any of that now because we're in multiple offers, everything
Right.
I write. So, you got to make your contract as clean as possible. And, you got an agent who's really on the ball and checks every little dot and digit and thing, and they're going to focus on that. But I
Right.
think that's open for discussion. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to jump in real quick on that.
No,
So-
you're not interrupting at all. Like I said, this is super informal. So I appreciate the interruptions because I feel like I'm just talking at everyone. So,
and I also was taught years ago, I never write in there. See where you have the other checked on line 154. I never put anything in there as recommended by the general inspector, because I think we have language already in here, don't we? Buyer's not.
yeah.
Hold on.
So you can do that. And I remember Nancy used to say to write in C lines, whatever to whatever it was. I think it was like 140 to 143 or something at that time.
I think, and Matt Nelson said, you don't need to put anything in there because it's already covered down here in the bottom. So
right.
Anyway, yeah, so it's just whatever you want to do. Okay, moving on. Sorry.
No, you're good. Okay, so this is important to keep these timelines in line here. Within 3 days from the date of that last elected inspection, the buyer shall elect one of the following options: to remove the inspection contingency and accept the property as is, to accept the property subject to the seller's repair of specific conditions or defects identified in a written inspection report by a professional licensed inspector or contractor, or terminate the agreement if the report identifies latent defects not previously disclosed in writing by any seller and by the seller and or any broker or agent. If the property is accepted as is, then the buyer signs the amendment to purchase agreement, removing the inspection contingencies, and the agreement just moves forward. If it's accepted subject to seller's repair of specific defects, then the buyer provides the seller with a copy of the inspection report and an amendment to the purchase agreement identifying the defects to be repaired. That's something that is new to this contract as of our last revision. So I know there's a lot of opinions on whether or not the buyer should provide the seller with a copy of the inspection report, especially in its entirety, since it belongs to the buyer. But my feeling is if you're going to ask for specific things to be repaired, you need to provide at least the documentation of those things.
And if I can just say, in my last 4 contracts that I wrote on with buyers, that entire paragraph is being struck.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what they're doing. I mean, just so you know, I'm not,
Yeah.
you know, they come back and just strike the whole contract, or you can strike it immediately before you even submit your offer.
yeah.
But,
Mhm.
you know, obviously,
I've
when
seen that too.
you know, because that's, you're going to strengthen your offer. If your buyer really wants the house, you're going to just strike that whole line 170 all the way down to 175, if that's what your buyer wants to do. But that's the market we're in right now.
Yeah, it's tough for sure. So the parties have 3 days if you're doing this and they're, you know, agreeing to ask for specific things. You have 3 days from the seller's receipt of the written list of defects to agree in writing which defects, if any, will be corrected at the seller's expense. If the parties do not agree in writing as to those repairs within those 3 days, then this agreement shall be deemed null and void, and the parties shall promptly sign a mutual release authorizing the earnest money to be returned to the buyer. So it's 3 days to get all of the defects there and submit those to the seller. And then it's 3 days to come to an agreement between the two parties about moving forward. If the buyer elects to terminate this agreement based on newly discovered material latent defects in the property, then the buyer shall provide a copy of the written inspection report to the seller, and the parties shall promptly sign a mutual release authorizing the earnest money to be returned to the buyer. That's another thing that a listing agent might cross out because they don't necessarily want that entire inspection report. If they receive the inspection report, then the seller has to disclose all of the major defects and basically amend their purchase, their property disclosure as well. The parties may modify dates for inspections, repairs, or the deadline for exercising their right to terminate the agreement by written mutual agreement. Upon the buyer's request, the seller shall provide reasonable access for the buyer to review of any repairs made by the seller. Any failure of buyer to request review of repairs before title transfer shall be deemed absolute waiver of the review and acceptance of the property as is. So that's what we were talking about before. Get that proof as early as you possibly can. And at the very least, check it at if it's something that you can visually see, check it at the final walkthrough as well. Pest and wood destroying insect. So this is the whole paragraph talking about, who's going to pay for it. Is it the buyer's expense or the seller's expense? Who's choosing the company that is doing the testing? And then also if it shows existing infestation or damage by pests, termites, or wood destroying insects, treatment of the condition shall be made by a licensed exterminating agency, which shall furnish a certificate of guarantee for a period of at least 1 year in the case of termites and/or at least 60 days in the case of wood destroying insects. All repairs and treatment paid by, and then you select who's going to pay for it, unless FHA or VA regulations prohibit payment by the buyer, in which case seller shall bear the cost. And it does protect both parties by saying this agreement can be terminated by the party paying for the repair and treatment if the cost exceeds $500. Lead-based paint. So very rarely does anybody do a lead-based paint inspection just because it's extremely costly. And there are not very many contractors really that do it either. But you want to at least make sure that they have received the pamphlet about the lead-based paint and also have received the disclosure from the seller disclosing if they know of any lead-based paint. If they disclose that they know that there's lead-based paint in the property, then that might come into play that you might want to do that and proceed from there. But very rarely does anybody choose to do the lead-based paint inspection. Megan's Law. This is just checking about sex offenders, and it does say that the seller has disclosed the buyer of all notices, and the buyer acknowledges that such information may no longer be accurate or complete, and agrees to inquire directly with the local sheriff's office or Ohio Attorney General's office. So it's, again, the buyer's due diligence to make sure. Condition of the property. The buyer has examined the property and agrees to purchase it in as is present physical condition, including any latent defects and defects disclosed by the seller on the property disclosure. And then the seller shall promptly notify the buyer in writing of any additional defects or disclosure items that arise between the date of acceptance and the date of recording the deed. This just says if you have received the residential property disclosure, generally that's going to be in the MLS supplements, or you can ask for it if it's not there. If they don't have it done yet, say it's a brand new listing and the seller just hasn't completed it yet or something of that nature, this gives you the opportunity to say that they have not received it. They can initial that. And then I typically say within 1 to 3 days for that, just to make sure. I would say 3 at the absolute maximum, because you want to make sure that your buyer has the chance to review that before moving too far into the transaction. This just lays out that the seller will deliver possession of the property in broom clean condition, free and clear of all debris and chattel. The seller shall pay all costs for repair of any gas line leak at the street and at the foundation at the time of the transfer of utilities. And the seller will comply with any governmental point of sale laws and ordinances. The buyer shall inquire directly with the applicable either way, local government if the buyer wishes to review any point of sale inspection information and other public records history of the property. The seller represents that the seller has not received any notices from government agencies about building code and or health and safety violations, except as disclosed by the seller. And then if it applies, the buyer and seller shall have, I typically put 5 days here after receipt by buyer of all notices to agree in writing which party will be responsible for the correction of any building code or health violation. And if they can't agree, then the agreement can be declared null and void. So, if the point of sale inspection has been ordered but not completed, then that is a situation where you would want to make sure that you give your buyer some time to make sure that either they're going to be comfortable accepting that, or if they're going to ask the seller to pay, and it gives you a little bit of time to work through that. Representations and disclaimers. The seller agrees that they have completed the property disclosure without any assistance. You should never help a client fill that form out. They need to do it completely independently to make sure that they are being 100% honest as possible. And you don't want to have anything to do with that in the event that it is disclosed that maybe they weren't as honest as they could have been. The parties hereby release and do indemnify and hold the broker and their agents harmless from any and all claims, actions, injuries, or damages relating to the property, including misrepresentations or omissions of seller. And they agree that the brokers and agents do not verify or investigate the seller's disclosures, including those on the property disclosure. The buyer represents that they have not relied on any written or verbal representations of any brokers or agents about the property, including without limitation, features, characteristics, improvements, multiple listing service descriptions, fitness, use, value, or condition, square footage, zoning, lot dimensions, mold, structures, soils, homeowner fees, public and private assessments, utilities, taxes, or special assessments. So again, everything that's in the MLS, you hope that that's as accurate as possible, but this is just acknowledging that realtors are human and there could be a mistake here and there, especially when it comes to, things with like square footage is a big one. People will say, well, actually, you put in the MLS, this is 11 by 12, but this room is only 11 by 11 or something like that. Or another one that people talk about is calling it hardwood versus wood floors, because depending on the kind of wood, it might not be hardwood. I know Michaeline had an issue with that. So it's just kind of protecting you to say, we try to be accurate, but there might be some errors here and there. If the improvements to the property are destroyed or damaged in excess of 10% of the purchase price before title transfer, then the buyer can either accept the insurance proceeds for the damage and complete the transaction, or terminate the agreement and receive the return of all deposits made. If the damage is less than 10% of the purchase price, then the seller should just restore the property to its prior condition. That's pretty close to it. This just lays out everything that might be related to the purchase agreement. So always, obviously, your agency disclosure, your residential property disclosure. If it's FHA or VA, you may have some things here. Concurrency, contingencies, condo addendum if there's an HOA, lead-based paint addendum, and then other, you can, if you have an escalation clause, we have that appraisal gap addendum now that could be in there. And that's about it. And then this just states that it's a binding agreement.
Katie, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Question, if you go back up to the addendums,
Mhm.
is there, I know that we are required now to check the box for your protection, get a home inspection. We are required to include that document with every contract, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've been putting a blank text box over FHA.
I just don't check it on here because we don't have to send it to the list agent anyway. It's more just to
Okay.
cover our own butts situation, especially with how much people have been waiving inspections. That's why we made the decision to do that, to have that required. But yeah, I never even check that when I'm writing an offer, just because I don't send it to the list agent or the lender or anything like that, unless it's FHA, and then I'll check it.
Okay, so I've been checking it and then, of course, adding that addendum. So we don't need to check that. Okay, okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
That's fine. Thanks.
Yep, binding agreement. That's just a bunch of legalese saying that this is a contract. And then you put your information in here. This earnest money deposit receipt, I recommend never checking that. Don't sign it unless you have a promissory note or you have a physical check in your hand. So if they're wiring it or using like an online tool like Ohio Real Title has, don't select that. Only sign this if you have a promissory note that's acting as a placeholder, or if there's an actual check that you have in your possession that you are taking to the title company. Otherwise, don't sign it. Then the seller signs it, put the listing agent contact information here. And then here down in the MLS information, we have this pre-filled for you, KW Living and our broker license number. You'll put your name and license number here and fill in as much as you can for the listing agent and brokerage. And that's the purchase agreement. Any questions or thoughts, discussion?
So Katie, if a buyer needs a contribution from the seller for closing costs, do you put that on this contract? And if so,
Yes.
where would you add it?
Yes, so that is something that I've called to Rick's attention to, that hopefully on the next contract, there will be a more defined spot for it, because we had it for a little bit and somehow on this one, it got left off. So the recommendation is that you can add a text box right at the bottom here. Okay. I've also seen, and you can say seller to contribute whatever, if it's, 3% or a flat amount or 3,500, whatever, to buyers closing costs, prepaids, and points.
Yep.
And I just put it there. I've seen people, especially, in the competitive market, I've seen people highlighting terms that might not stick out, but that are important for the listing agent and seller to be able to review. I've also seen people put it like up here. So that's the recommendation right now, or doing a blank addendum, but it's just as easy to put it on here and then you don't have to worry about it. Anything else?
Can we go back to the commission section on the last page?
Sure. So this part right here.
Yes. So I had a case recently whereby it was a for sale by owner, and the buyer agreed to pay the commission. So
Mhm.
how would you insert that?
So
Or is
That's
that an
a-
addendum?
yeah, that's a good question, because you have the unrepresented seller agreement, right? So you could add it there that the buyer agrees to pay it, but then maybe and this might be a good thing for us. I can ask Rick what he would suggest as well, just to make sure that we have something, you know,
Yeah.
really, really solid here. And maybe it would be
So
a
you
text
just,
box or something, just to say paid by the buyer, or like
Okay.
maybe putting a text box over here and saying from buyer
from
per buyer representation agreement is where it would be. Yeah, per the buyer representation.
okay.
That's what I would say to do until we hear otherwise, but I'll follow up with Rick on that.
Okay, good.
Because I don't think that that's super clearly laid out in this contract. So before, when we had the spaces for it, you could kind of, change it around, but now it's just kind of there in writing. So,
Okay.
ah,
And then the other thing that I noticed at around line 50, I think we have the electronic signature section.
Mhm.
So does that, is there a need? Because I know we have another document for cybersecurity warning. Is there a need for that document, or is that a duplication?
Yeah, that's no longer required to be submitted. So
Okay.
it's still available, because some people, like, if they have a client that they think might be very prone to believing something, they might duplicate that, but it's not technically required now, for compliance or anything else, because
Okay.
of this paragraph.
Okay, good.
We have about 3 minutes left. Good discussion today.
So the other thing that I learned from, apart from everything else, was about the inspectors being certified by the state of Ohio. So I've always said in the past ASHI, but I guess I need to change that.
Yeah, they have to be, they're now licensed through the Division of Real Estate, just like us.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, good. Well, Kady, thank you very much
I'm
indeed.
glad that they are, because that gives appraisers are licensed, we're licensed. It adds a little bit more, protection for the consumer, that there's a board that they have to answer to. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Kady. It's been a very good refresher course for me.
Good. I'm glad. And thanks. I'm glad you were here, so you could add your input here and there too. It's nice to not be the only person talking. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's always good.
Anything else, you guys? Any last minute questions?
Thank you. Super helpful.
Good. Yeah. Thanks for jumping on this lovely Saturday morning, and stay warm. I think we're hopefully done with snow
Hope so.
for
We'll
today.
see. There's always an April snow.
I know.
feel like.
I meant this particular storm. So,
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was
We'll get some
muted.
in
There's a lot of
April.
noise in my house on Saturday mornings.
totally get it. Totally
Yeah.
get it. All right. I'll talk to everyone later.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.